хотел бы пригласить сейчас нашу гостью из Германии, которая приехала из Университета Констанца на юге, на границе со Швейцарией. Практически это Алейда Ассманн. И говорить она будет о трансформирующей силе памяти. Фрау Ассманн, доктор Ассманн. Bitte sehr.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for the generous invitation to come to Moscow in this rather dramatic week and to speak on this timely topic in such a wonderful congregation of colleagues from different fields. I want to thank the organizers to be able to be part of this, and I'm knowing that I will profit immensely from this event. I will now turn to my presentation and will put the focus on the question of models of memory. Starting with a quote from a book which some of you may have read. It's by the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, who dedicated his book Ethics of Memory to his parents, whom it introduces to the reader in the second page of his preface. He says, "From early childhood, I witnessed an ongoing discussion between my parents on memory." Margalit then reconstructs this parental dialogue, which started after the Second World War, when it became obvious that both of their huge families in Europe had been destroyed. And this is now what the mother used to say. The Jews were irretrievably destroyed. What is left is just a pitiful remnant of the great Jewish people. The only honorable role for the Jews that remains is to form communities of memory, to serve as soul candles, like the candles that are ritually kindled in memory of the dead. And this is what the father used to answer. We, the remaining Jews, are people, not candles. It is a horrible prospect for anyone to live just for the sake of retaining the memory of the dead. This is what the Armenians opted to do, and they made a terrible mistake. We should avoid it at all costs. Better to create a community that thinks predominantly about the future and reacts to the present, not a community that is governed from mass graves. Now, after 1945, it was first the father's position that prevailed, and not only in Israel. What mattered then in Israel was the collective project of founding a new state, of forging a new beginning for survivors, and opening up the future for successive generations. 4 decades later, however, during the 1980s, the mother's position became more and more dominant. The survivors turned to the past that they had held at a distance for so long. After the foundation of the state had been politically accomplished and confirmed by 2 wars, Yad Vashem became the symbolic cultural center of the nation of Israeli society, and transformed itself more and more into a ritualistic community of memory. Now, Margalit has presented 2 paradigmatic solutions for the problem of dealing with a traumatic past: remembering or forgetting, either preservation of the past or orientation towards the future. I want to argue today that we are no longer dealing with only these 2 mutually exclusive models, but are now experimenting with 3 or perhaps with 4. And I will briefly introduce these during my presentation. The first is going to be mutual forgetting. The next one is remembering in order to never forget. Third model, remembering in order to overcome. And the fourth one I call dialogic memory. I start with mutual forgetting. Mutual forgetting was implemented after civil wars, for instance, after the 30 Years' War. The peace treaty in 1648, Münster-Osnabrück, contains the formula perpetua oblivio et amnestia. This policy of forgetting often goes hand in hand with a blanket amnesty. In order to end mutual hatred and to achieve a new social integration of formerly opposed parties, forgetting was prescribed. And it is interesting now that even after 1945, something that most of us are not so conscious of today anymore, forgetting was still widely used as a political resource. In post-war Germany, let me first take the example of Winston Churchill, who gave an influential speech in 1946 in Zurich to the young students. And what he said there was the following: we must all turn our backs upon the horrors of the past. We must look to the future. We cannot afford to drag forward across the years that are to come the hatreds and revenges which have sprung from the injuries of the past. If Europe is to be saved from infinite misery and indeed from final doom, there must be an act of faith in the European family and an act of oblivion against all the crimes and follies of the past. Now, this sounds rather dramatic nowadays from our point of view, but I would like to emphasize that at that time, the notion of forgetting was not yet used in this Freudian sense of repression. It was solely conceived of a new possibility of opening a new page of history and entering the future. In Germany at the same time, you could say that after 1945, what prevailed was this communicative silence, a pact of silence, and the key words of the era from the 1950s through the 60s were Schlussstrich, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or Wiedergutmachung. All these terms had to do with the idea of putting this past behind without first remembering it. So this was my brief introduction to the first one, which I called mutual forgetting. Now, paradigmatic shift from the model of forgetting to a new orientation towards remembering occurred with the return of Holocaust memory in Germany in various steps and stages. I can abridge this. It was the Auschwitz trial, or prior to that, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1980. We could also name 1978 or 9, the Holocaust television series. The impact of this event spilled over to those who had no share in the historical experience and created a new kind of shared empathy across generations. Then in the 1980s, there were two influential moments for the return of Holocaust memory. It was the Weizsäcker speech, who taught the Germans to think of 1945 in terms of 8th of May in terms of liberation rather than in terms of a defeat. And then we also had this event 2 days before the Weizsäcker speech, or 3 days, May 5th, Kohl and Reagan visiting cemetery where there were also SS soldiers buried, trying actually to lay the past to rest before addressing and facing it. And this was what was done in the other picture below there. This was the immediate reaction in May 1985 in Berlin. Students and people going out and going to a particular site in Berlin that had been torn down, namely the Gestapo-Zentrale, the central police station of Nazi Germany, center, the focus of violence here, and they started digging up what then later on and now is called the topography of terror with a new museum. So these are a couple of steps that show you the return of this memory in Germany, and now the present stage is a new kind of memory that I can only define as remember in order to never forget. It's a new form of memorialization, and the international community that was created is formerly the ITF, now it's called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, now with 31 member countries, all dating back to this declaration in Stockholm, creating a new kind of model which had never been there in the world before. It's a unique new form, and I call this the second model, remember in order to never forget. My third model is now remembering in order to overcome. The cumulative process of returning Holocaust memory was a decisive event in the 1980s that brought about a profound change in sensibility also in other places of the world in dealing with historic traumas. Against this background of a new awareness of the suffering of victims in a new, and this is important, in a new human rights framework, forgetting was no longer acceptable as a general policy in overcoming atrocities of the past. Remembering became a new political claim when dealing with other historic traumas, such as the dictatorships in South America, the South African regime of apartheid, colonial history, or the crime of slavery. In most of these discourses about other atrocities, references and metaphorical allusions to the Holocaust were made because that had become a memory icon, but I want to argue that although the Holocaust became quickly the prototype of traumatic memories and was and is still regularly invoked in the rhetoric of memory activists all over the world, it was not chosen as a model. The other model is my third model, and in this case I would argue remembering is not implemented in order to memorialize an event of the past into an indefinite future, but is introduced as a therapeutic tool to cleanse, to purge, to heal, or to reconcile. It is not pursued as an end in itself, but as a means to an end, which is the transformation of values in a society and the forging of a new beginning. And this is exactly what I would like to call the transformative potential or power of remembering. Now, without a clear facing and working through the atrocities of the past from the point of view of those who had suffered, this is a new consensus. The process of social, national, or transnational reconciliation cannot begin. In this context now, remembering is the beginning of a process, not its end and aim. Cultures have indeed produced ample evidence for such forms of transitory or transitional remembering. In the ritual framework of Christian confession, for instance, remembering is the introduction to forgetting. The sins have to be publicly articulated and listed and listened to before they can be blotted out through the absolution of the priest. A similar logic is at work in the artistic concept of catharsis. Through the representation of a painful event on stage, a traumatic past can be once more collectively relived and overcome in the very process of doing so. According to the theory of Aristotle, the group that undergoes such a process is purged in this shared experience. Forgetting through remembering is also at bottom the goal of Freudian psychotherapy. A painful past has to be raised onto the level of language and consciousness before, in order, one is able to move forward and to leave it behind. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa created a new form of public ritual which combined features of the tribunal, the cathartic drama, and the Christian confession. In these public rituals, a traumatic event had to be publicly narrated and shared. The victim had to tell his or her experiences, and they had to be witnessed and acknowledged by the accused before they could be relegated to a shared past. And another example for this third model would be a new response to the disenfranchised discourse of human rights and mutual global media observation. And this was the memory policy of public apology. We are, without doubt, writes my colleague Christopher Dase, in an age of apologies. The Pope apologizes for the Inquisition, the United Nations apologized for their inactiveness during the genocide in Rwanda, the Queen apologizes for the repression of the Maori in New Zealand, President Jacques Chirac for the Dreyfus affair, and President Bill Clinton for the slave trade. So this is another form of acknowledging the point of view of the victims and introducing their story into the master narrative. My point here is that we are dealing with two different models. Just to make it clear once more, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, in the sense of mastering the past, is the explicit aim of the third model, while Vergangenheitsbewahrung, or perpetual preservation of a normative past, is the second model. We have learned in the meantime that a new beginning cannot be forged on a tabula rasa, which was the idea of the mutual forgetting policy, nor is there such a thing as an hour zero. To begin anew requires no longer forgetting, but remembering. But in this case, remembering is not the aim and end of the process, but only its medium. It is there to facilitate recognition, reconciliation, and eventually forgetting, or in the sense of sharing the knowledge, and putting the traumatic past behind in order to be able to forge and a new beginning and imagine a common future. Here we come to my fourth model. It is dialogic remembering. While the third model, with this third model, we have looked at cases in which state transitions from dictatorship to democracy occur, and a new moral consensus is created in a society. My fourth model applies to situations that transcend such internal reconstructions of nations and societies. It concerns the memory policy of two or more states that share a common legacy of traumatic violence. Two countries engage in a dialogic memory if they face a shared history of mutual violence by mutually acknowledging their own guilt and empathy with the suffering they have inflicted on others. As a rule, national memories are not dialogic but monologic. They are constructed in such a way that they are identity enhancing and self-celebrating. Their main function since the 19th century is generally to enhance and celebrate a positive collective self-image. National memories are therein closely aligned to national myths, which Peter Sloterdijk has appropriately termed modes of auto-hypnosis. With respect to traumatic events, these myths provide effective protection shields against events that a nation prefers to forget. When facing negative events in the past, there are only three dignified roles for the national collective to assume. Either that of the victor who has overcome the evil, or that of the resistor who has heroically fought the evil, or that of the victim who has passively suffered the evil. Everything else lies outside the scope of these memory perspectives is conveniently forgotten. Now, we have seen that after the Second World War, for instance, with the Germans in the evident role of the perpetrators, all the other national memories chose one of these dignified positions. The narrative of the victor, of course, was that of the Allies, The narrative of the resistor was assumed in the GDR and by France in very different ways. The narrative of the victim, again in different ways, was chosen by Poland and Austria. European archives, however, brought to light a number of documents that challenged some of these clear-cut memory constructions after 1989. In Western Europe, the national constructions of memory have now become much more complex through the acknowledgement of collaboration. In many Eastern states, however, the memory of the Holocaust has to compete with the memory of one's own victimhood and suffering under communist oppression, which is a hot memory that emerged only after the end of the Cold War. Because there is a notorious shortage, as I would like to call it, shortage of memory space and memory capacity in national memory, the atrocities that one has suffered claim a much more space than the atrocities that one has committed. And I will give you just a few examples of new practices of dialogic memory from the point of view of Germany, and all of this is going on during this and the last year, so there are many, many commemorative events having to do with establishing more dialogic memories. Here you see President Gauck in Greece. In March you see him in Oradour, which is last year. You see him together with President Hollande at the Hartmannsweiler Kopf, commemorating the beginning of the Great War, and here laying the foundation stone for a place of reconciliation for the memory of the Great War, and here in Lüttich, Belgium, commemorating the German invasion at the beginning of the Great War. Another one, September, all very recently. He was really traveling a lot in these last days, as you can see, recalling the beginning of the Second World War, the invasion of Poland, together with Poland's head of state, Komorowski. But I would argue there are still quite a number of issues that are still very undialogic in German memory. I give you a short list. Maybe just one is that usually in the minds or heads of the people in Germany, the Second World War started really in June 22nd, 41, and not in September 1, 39. You can tell it by two events. For instance, the exhibition of the crimes of the Wehrmacht started only in 41, so Poland was skipped over. Nobody took really offense, so that was a kind of consensus. And the second one would be that the ZDF series, Our Fathers, Our Mothers, again started in June 41. So that's usually the German way to deal with this. And another thing is that Germans notoriously, especially even their president, Herzog, when he came to Poland, mixed up two Warsaw events, the Warsaw Uprising in 44 and the Ghetto Uprising. The Germans only know about the Ghetto Uprising. They don't even know anything about the Warsaw Uprising 1 year later. So with respect to Russian, there is the Leningrad blockade. But here I would like to show that this year in German Parliament, Daniel Ranin got to give a speech to remind the Germans of this event. So there's always a lot to catch up on. I'm coming to my conclusions, and I'm giving them to you. Here is the list. I would end with this, like to end as I started with Margalit, I end with Oz. He said, if I had a say in the peace talks, no matter where and why, Oslo or wherever, I would instruct the sound technicians to turn off the microphones as soon as one of the negotiating parties starts to talk about the past. They are paid for financing solutions for the present and the future. Now, as I said again with respect to Margalit, I will say it again with respect to Oz. It is not that easy. We cannot make that easy. This distinction, very often the future, as we know, has to be built up on reconfrontation with the past, and I think the same is also true for the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And the last point is, in order to judge memory policies, I think we need to have a number of criteria in order to evaluate them. Here are just a couple of suggestions. One question is, does it make a society more revengeful or more self-conscious and accountable in relating to its past? Does it foster animosities in the society, or does it render it more dialogic with respect to its neighbors? And lastly, does it make the citizens more sensitive or more callous to human rights violations, and more exclusionary or willing to integrate minorities? Thank you very much.